What did rock bottom taste like during the hardest times in history? These forgotten poor man's lunches were born out of desperation, but some were surprisingly clever, filling, and even delicious. No one makes them anymore, but maybe they should. One of the most popular things that people would ever eat back in the day was bread with meat drippings. Despite what you might think, this is really just stale bread with leftover drippings that were squeezed out. People weren't fond of letting the drippings go to waste back then. They could be used as a cooking fat, as a dip, or as a coating to increase flavor. Poor people would generally try their best to keep a steady supply of them. This was also one of the most popular meals to come out of the Great Depression because of how economical it was. It also luckily worked better with bran and rye bread instead of the fluffy, white wheat flour one we're used to. That meant that the dish was able to hit a bigger audience because a lot of people were barred from ever being able to buy fluffy white flour-based bread. These were okay, really. Just an average breakfast to get you started, but they were wonderful at stretching out the pantry and making sure things stay for as long as possible. Also, if there's ever something you need toast for, but you're just out of butter, syrup, or whatever, this is a pretty okay alternative. Another thing that people relied on rather frequently was cornmeal mush. I can't begin to tell you how much people loved cornmeal. From peasants to farmers to Native Americans and everybody in between the West and East, cornmeal was something that had really spread. It was like that one food of the nation that everyone just knew. Corn is one of the few things that grows as easily as it does in the United States, and it means that the potential for mass use is so strong. Cornmeal mush might not do well by today's standards because it's a rustic, simple dish, but back then this mush was enough to make your morning a bit more optimistically. When a lot of people had nothing else to eat, they would often turn to cornmeal. When people had no way of stretching their pantries until the next salary, there was little to go for. Corn was one of the few things people could make in 100 different ways, and it was virtually free or literally free if you had your own farming grounds. Ketchup sandwiches are also in the same vein of, I don't really have anything else here. It's definitely some bare bones cooking, but when you're down on your luck financially, it's not really the time to be picky. Ketchup sandwiches were usually made with brown bread because whatever white bread you could buy, you could also just get a lot more like potatoes, root vegetables, and onions instead. Those things could be made into soups and stews, so there were very few disadvantaged people actively relying on white bread. Ketchup was also fairly different in the 20th century than it is here. It felt more natural, it had a stronger tomato flavor, and it was a lot cheaper. A bottle of Heinz doesn't cost anything but a few cents. What people would do is sometimes take the meat drippings idea and mix it in with these ketchup sandwiches. They would spread the drippings on the bread or use it as a dip, and if nothing else, it definitely added some more interesting qualities to otherwise usually stale bread. How about you? Have you ever satisfied your hunger with nothing but ketchup and bread when times were rough? Personally, I think that just wouldn't begin to really fill me. So lard sandwiches were very similar to bread and meat drippings in the way they were used. Instead of being a standalone dip, though, or a cooking fat used to toast the bread, these were instead coated with lard. The idea was to use it as a spread and basically just make a sandwich that way. What people would do to spice it up if they could is add scraps of meat if there were any, or some potatoes. They would mash them up, fry them lightly, and use the cutlets as a makeshift patty. It would actually work sometimes, but it was also a lot of work. The good thing about lard sandwiches was that they were ridiculously time efficient. It takes about 2 minutes maximum to make these, and then you have your lunch for work ready. Plus, it helps that people constantly feel rejuvenated thanks to the lard. It worked really well on those hard, labor-intensive days where you had nothing else to eat. It was also a fantastic option for long journeys because it was transportable, easy to carry, and high in energy and fat. However, it did spoil fast and easily, so it wasn't the most ideal solution for really long journeys. A good way to make it a bit better was to add root vegetables, mushrooms, and typical sandwich toppings to it, which I personally love doing. Bean sandwiches were one of the most important staples for people living not just in the 20th century, but for people all over America for thousands of years. So many of the beans we've become so accustomed to were literally the lifeblood of several communities for a long time. Pinto beans, navy beans, kidney beans, black eye beans, These may be things that we just occasionally use in a salad nowadays, but for a lot of people, having these was the difference between meeting your budget for the month and having to get a loan from somewhere. You could make bean sandwiches with a minimal amount of beans, and they were able to provide some much-needed nutrition and protein in people's diets that they otherwise wouldn't be getting. Some people were not even able to afford the awful cuts of meat or the very cheap ones that butchers would typically discard. They would save whatever meat they had for weekends, celebrations, or for when they really couldn't tolerate eating a makeshift bare-bones meal anymore. Bean sandwiches, thus, were really good at sustaining families, and they were the food of choice for people who had labor-intensive, physically demanding jobs back then, such as factorymen. Or milk toast was a common meal for many working-class and poor Americans. This was doubly true if you were living in the 19th and 20th centuries. I mean, like bean sandwiches, this is something that I feel was always just popular, but it was never really massively used like it was in these 2 centuries. It was very easy to digest, it was something that filled you up, and it was a great way to repurpose any stale bread you had. The appeal of milk toast was pretty good in that regard. You got a filling, sweet dessert out of it, and you also got to take care of any bread that was about to go bad. For low-income families, milk toast was a good way to stretch very limited resources. Stale bread works just fine with warm milk, and in rural areas where families had their own cattle and cows or access to fresh dairy at wholesale prices, it was even more of a thing. Onion sandwiches are not really hard to understand. They're simple, inexpensive meals that were common among many poor Americans. Plus, there's no secret here. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's just raw onion sliced into thin shapes placed between 2 slices of bread. At most, people would add in whatever butter, salt, or pepper they could spare, and it was something that was favored by people who really wanted an easy-to-prepare meal. Onions also had the benefit of being some of the cheapest vegetables available in the entire market. They also were great for storage, which means that they were able to be bought in bulk without you worrying about them going bad. Bread was also something that people always had in stock, and many families would be relying on meals like this to get by. If they could not afford to buy their own bread, a lot of people would make their own bread or purchase day-old loaves at a discounted price. Onions weren't ever something expensive, but people could also grow them, and many who lived on the outskirts of urban cities and communities did this. They were also a common crop even within these communities because people had their own home gardens. Despite the simplicity, though, the onion sandwich was a knockout. It could really fill you up. The meals we've had so far are really cheap, make-do food, but they still are a proper meal. Hardtack and water is not really something you can say this about. Hardtack and water was literally something people only ate in the worst of times when they had absolutely nothing else to work with. A simple cracker-like biscuit made of flour and water was one of the most common foods in America for around 2 entire centuries. It saw so many different eras, events, and wars. People associated it with famine, regular inflation spikes, Civil War rationing, the Depression, and so much more. Seafaring traders would keep a steady stock of hardtack, and it was actually even more important for them. This is because next to cockroaches, diamonds, and titanium, hardtack might be the most indestructible thing on the planet. When the thing is stored properly, it literally can stay good for years without spoiling, and this is something that you'd usually expect of food that's been put through preservatives. Plus, the economical benefit was unmatched. With just some flour, water, and salt, hardtack was one of the easiest things to make at home. Also, one of the most boring things. Spam and crackers are a classic that you are all very aware of, but what you might not know is that after the Depression and war ended, these were the lifelines of people across the entire country. I know we've all heard so many stories of how spam was nearly invaluable during the Depression, but it's also been something that's worth all of its weight in gold in later eras too. For a lot of people, spam and crackers were the most ideal and reliable breakfast, something that became steeped and ingrained in their daily routine to the point that they just did not know what to do without it. Do you have anything like that? Maybe a bowl of oatmeal you need to get your day started. A favorite cereal that you just can't get out of bed without. Maybe you really need your usual peanut butter and jam sandwich. Whatever makes you tick, everyone was sustained by spam and crackers. You could make casseroles out of sandwiches, use it in stews, and even make gravies out of it. You could dip crackers into a makeshift dip at home and also enjoy them that way. Spread some lard on them with the Spam, or make a very nice sandwich with the crackers, Spam and celery or iceberg. It would be low effort and really quick, so it was the perfect thing to make for when you were in a rush. Grits and butter were a foundational meal for a lot of different kinds of poor families, but this was particularly true for anybody living in the South. This was even more true for black sharecroppers and tenant farmers. Working-class white families survived most of the 19th and 20th centuries off of foods like this too, but it really cemented itself as a staple of the black community back then. Corn was one of the most widely grown crops in the South, and grits, which were just ground hominy and cornmeal, were a very nice byproduct. Plus, back then, people lived and died by the waste absolutely nothing mentality. They would not let any byproduct go to waste because why should they? It was something they could get in bulk for literally a few pennies. Plus, just like rice and potatoes, grits provided an incredible amount of stamina and energy. Laborers often were also poor and did not have the money to really buy elaborate rations or pick and choose their nutrition, so starchy, fibrous foods were their best friends. Sugar bread was an inexpensive meal that a lot of poor Americans, especially children, ate when there was nothing else they had. It was something that was literally just as bare bones as you could imagine. Plain bread, sprinkled with only a modest amount of sugar, spread with butter and dipped in a little bit of milk. It was a way to stretch ingredients, but people tried their best to make it feel like it was a sweet treat regardless. Of course, it was hard to take it that way, but it really shows you how resilient people were and how ingenious their plans were when it came to rationing things out. Bread was really cheap and filling, and it was especially one of the best things people who were farmsteaders relied on. Plus, sugar was also just as important for people who lived in the city. It was a quick burst of energy that really set people right, and while it was not cheap, a small amount could do a lot for a plain slice of bread. Also, that crunch was just addictive. You didn't need to cook it, and it was a decent pick-me-up for what it was worth. Cabbage and noodles were one of the most affordable vegetable-based dishes you could get for yourself. The best thing about cabbages were the way they were available year-round, and let me just put things into perspective for you. Back then, the seasonal nature of things was something that was instrumental to how people planned out their budgets, their groceries, and what they were going to be eating that week. You may also think that without refrigeration, noodles wouldn't really be sustainable, but people would simply make the noodles from scratch when they needed it. Hard work, I know, but at least you didn't need a lot of the stuff. A simple head of cabbage, one bag of noodles that was enough to feed a family of up to 4 and 5, and it was an incredibly popular thing in cities, though there may have been some cultural gaps in preferences. In the South, it never really caught on the same way. It's definitely quite a refreshing dish, though. Now this one might really take you for a bit of a doozy. Peanut butter and mayonnaise sandwiches emerged as a trend, and one that was here to stay, at least as far as the Great Depression went. It was something that people swore by too, though. There were the opposers. It was an overall divisive combination because there was a decent chunk of people that genuinely found it supremely unappetizing, like, how does that make any sense? I personally see their point of view. There were also people who really thought this was far superior to peanut butter and jelly. While they both took completely different approaches to a sandwich, with peanut butter and jelly being sweet and light, and this being tangy and creamy, it definitely set people into two teams. You had your traditionalists, and you had the modernists. But hey, passionate and heated public discourse aside, the practical pros of this dish were definitely up there, though I'm not sure if it's fair to call it a dish. Peanut butter and mayonnaise were really inexpensive, and they were able to last for ages, and peanut butter was something that was really thick and sticky. During the Depression, a lot of people wanted to somehow make it last longer, and mixing it with mayonnaise made it smoother and also easier to spread. Do you ever get super annoyed spreading peanut butter? It's like if you try to play it rational, you just can't get the spread going, but if you try to actually get it covered, you end up using too much. Bit of a waste, isn't it? It was a waste people back then really couldn't afford. So poor families in the South and the Appalachian regions had their own ways of getting by. Pinto beans and cornbread was a lot more than just a simple staple meal that people were relying on to get by. It was something that was essentially just survival. Pinto beans were considered very cheap and nutritious, and they were one of the most affordable sources of protein. They were packed with fiber, calories, and they were really filling. Dried beans were also resistant to being spoiled, and they could be bought in bulk, stored for months, and just be used in a variety of different ways. Pinto beans were also really good because they did not require much cooking equipment for it to work. Cornmeal was something that was widely available, a lot cheaper than your typical wheat flour, and it was something that didn't require any kind of yeast either. You just needed water, salt, and a little bit of pepper. Some pots and a cast iron skillet would work perfectly fine, and the best part was that this would last literally days and days, although the kids definitely had to get used to it. Mashed potato pancakes were a really popular way for poor people to last the weeks and months. Next to corn, potatoes were arguably everybody's best friend. This isn't even something that lasted just throughout the Depression. It's something that you could say was true for almost all of the 20th century. Potatoes were one of the most affordable staple crops that were grown in the world, and they could last you for decent chunks of the year. Leftover mashed potatoes might be unappetizing when you leave them just like that, but they could also be turned into a really warm and crispy dish. Plus, unlike yeast-based breads, these mashed potato pancakes didn't really need to be baked or need any special ingredients. They were mostly okay just as they were. They could be made on a wood stove, a coal stove, or even a pan on an open fire. This is one of those dishes that did spectacular with the children as well, and the frying process in particular made the pancakes really crispy. It was actually even better than how we normally make them, if any of these references hold up in reality. Boiled dandelion greens were their own variety of fun, quick, easy, and refreshing. It's a bit hard to go wrong when you're working with dandelions. There's just so much you can do with them. When you boil them, they become incredibly soft, mushy, and light to digest. Pairing them with other greens to make a do-it-yourself. Salad at home is also something that working-class people had gotten pretty good at. Some iceberg, spinach, or broccoli actually went pretty decently with these greens. The real benefit was in how nutritious and abundant they were, though. It's actually surprising that more people don't eat that way now. Dandelions were believed to help with your immune system, your digestion, and your overall inflammation. The real cherry, or in this case, leaf on top, is the way they are so abundant in almost every natural setting. You can find these growing in dandelions, roadsides, fields, and backyards. It's literally insane how much potential they have for foraging. Plus, these don't even have to be cultivated. It becomes a natural, free source of vitamins A, C, and K. I think the best part about rice and milk is simply how much you can do with them. Rice and milk has always been something associated with the working class in many cultures, and it's one of those things that just happens on its own. Rice is such an easy-to-grow crop, and it adapts so well to most American soil, but this dish can actually be so many different things depending on what you want to do with it. You can turn it into porridge, pudding, soup, or make a gravy out of it. It works just as well with beans and drippings, and all you need to do with it? Just take a pot of water and start boiling. Plus, you get everything you want. Carbohydrates, proteins, essential vitamins, and more. You can get a tangy flavor, a sweet dessert, or a spicy mix. Another really interesting aspect of this is all the different cultures that have their own take on rice. Like if you went to Asian communities at the time, you would find lots of people making kheer. If you went to a more European-centric town, then you would get something like creamy rice pudding. There's as many possibilities with rice as there are grains in a single bowl. Cabbage soup has been a classic working-class meal for so many centuries, it's hard to really tell where it comes from anymore. It's something that was always valued for its incredible affordability, its immense amount of nutrition, and the potential it has for feeding such a large crowd. Another thing about the 20th century is that there was an incredible amount of babies being born. Families were spiking up in numbers, and most households were not single-child ones. It was more common for a typical home in Kentucky or California to consist of at least 4 people. That's also why so many of the dishes you see on this list are all centered toward group meals and feeding a lot of people. Cabbage soup is particularly good at this, and that's why it has such an impressive resume. It's been a staple of people who are in tough times, especially throughout much of the Great Depression. Cabbage soup is something that can also be spiced up in a few different ways depending on what you do with it. Most people would add some kind of spice or serve it with potatoes at least. Cold boiled potatoes with salt is some proper, hardcore textbook survivalist eating. You know when your dad just tells you to imagine what you're like in a time of war or something and eat whatever there is at home? So people really used to do that. But you might be wondering, what does cold boiling something even mean? As far as anyone's ever known, boiling always involved heat. Well, sorry to burst your bubble, but this just refers to boiling them and eating them cold. It's something that's always been sustaining several generations of laborers, farmers, and working-class families and people. It was very cheap, plentiful, and potatoes were something that were growing in several kinds of climates. Still, this just sounds so bland and dry. It feels like you'd just be forcing yourself to eat it, and even among working-class people, there were other preferences for food that tasted better. I guess the only reason people really preferred these is because of the way you were able to make them with such minimal effort. Most working-class people preferred meals that just didn't require a lot of kitchen utensils or equipment, or even a constant supply or gas. That was something that was never guaranteed in rural areas. Banana and mayonnaise sandwiches are somehow substantially worse than peanut butter and mayonnaise sandwiches. Regardless, nobody was eating these for the taste. This is actually a little bomb of energy, and I'm going to explain how. Mayonnaise is something that is calorically dense and full of energy, and bananas are, as you know, fantastic sources of that too. You'll notice that a lot of these recipes make use of what is naturally available in the environment as well as byproducts of things. Bananas were fruits that grew in abundance across the South, the Midwest, and most of the Appalachian regions, so there were always ample amounts of bananas available for people. This is something you would always see people in factories or fields eating because, being honest, they needed the energy more than anyone else. Funnily enough, it's always something that kids would eat too, despite having enough energy to last. Molasses with bread is a classic working-class meal that has sustained so many different groups of people. It's honestly surprising we don't have some kind of mass official record for it, because seriously, if you ever had issues with finances or if the economy had been kicking you too hard, you definitely had molasses with bread. Just like a banana and mayonnaise sandwich, this was a very simple and energy-rich combination that was widely consumed and eaten due to how affordable it was. Like I said, being resourceful and using all kinds of byproducts was simply the norm in these times, and molasses were considered a byproduct of sugar refining. White mineral sugar itself was a bit too difficult for most people to sustainably get. Molasses are something very rich in iron and B vitamins. And bread itself is something that's rich in carbohydrates. Molasses are something that were a major export of most sugar plantations, and that's actually how it became so widespread. Everybody was working in these plantations, and factory workers in particular survived off of energy-dense foods like molasses and bread. Over time, it just became a symbol that the people associated poverty and struggle with. Towards the 21st century, people began to forget about molasses as sugar became far more affordable and normalized, but that was a shift mostly self-contained in cities. The next best thing when you didn't even have potatoes, corn, or molasses was oatmeal with water. It's something that's so incredibly concentrated with protein, and it's also something that requires such little effort to cook and make. If you don't have any kind of milk, you could always just use water. Milk was something that people didn't always have because it was hard to afford, and even if some of them could, they may just have lived too far away from stores and cities to get a milk run. The people that had their own cows and farms were still significantly better off in that regard because they had a constant supply of dairy. Oatmeal with water was never half as nice as with milk, but it was a godsend nonetheless. Oatmeal in general has been a dish that has sustained so many families, and besides the miracles it can work for your body and muscles, it's also the perfect thing to eat when you really need to be conserving food. Oats have an incredible amount of fiber to them as well, and when you eat them, you must have noticed they keep you full for so much longer. This is one of the main reasons why people wanted to eat oatmeal. One of the most wonderful things about canned beans is simply all of the different kinds of items that are taken. One of the nicest combinations that you can have with canned beans is pairing it up with fried slices of Bologna. This is such an intensely flavorful combination that people that do not even mind the fact that it did not really fill you up as much as some of the other ones on this list. In spite of that, sometimes you really need comfort food. You need food that fuels to eat, that tastes good to eat, and this is exactly what that was for a lot of people. I know that a lot of people may immediately believe or assume that you should always be extremely conservative if you're in a tough spot. But even the most resilient people need a break and a chance to restore their stamina with something good. How many times has it been that you had the worst possible day at work and your only comfort was a Bologna sandwich? Plus, it didn't cost an incredible amount to get this. It was an occasional treat and one that a lot of people held very dearly to their hearts in tough times. How many bowls of oatmeal can you really expect someone to chow down with a straight face every day? Sliced hot dogs with a white bread is also something that just reminded people of all the fun they would have. It was comfort food, something that was sorely missing in their lifestyles. And also this list as well. I mean, a lot of this is something that you would call a military diet. With some mayonnaise and ketchup, a sliced hot dog felt pretty damn close to heaven as far as most people were concerned. You could find these hot dogs in any kind of butcher's shop too, but it was rare to find chicken hot dogs. Most people would get sausages made out of offal meat or discarded meat that was incredibly cheap. A lot of these old-time butcher shops would also just pick up on the fact that working-class folk had a demand for the pieces of meat they would usually throw away, and that's why they would sell them at really discounted prices. This was a dish that parents saved for most of their children so they got better food or for really tough and hard days. Plus, it was again one of those things where you did not really need a lot to make it work. You just needed water to boil it, and if you had ice boxes, you could store away the hot dogs for later use. Sometimes people would even take the carcass of their cattle to butchers to get meat made, so it would not go to waste. Egg drop soup was a nourishing dish that was also a practical meal for most kinds of families that were living in the Great Depression. That entire decade, as nightmarish as it was, gave an incredible amount of street food to the country, the blueprints of which we are still using today. Made with just eggs and basic seasonings, egg drop soup was a pretty fulfilling meal for the amount of effort and simplicity it had. Plus, dishes like these really helped because there were a fair amount of people who had raised their own chickens, and this was a tradition among most families who had their own farms or lived in rural areas or just the South. The recipe required just a few ingredients, and it was very accessible even to the poorest households. True to street food nature, it was incredibly adaptable and versatile too. People could bulk up the soup with whatever vegetables they had on hand. Throwing in some crackers, some celery and onions, all of these were amazing ways of making an aromatic yet intensely flavorful soup. All it would take is water, 1 or 2 eggs, and just a little bit of pepper. Black or red, either was your choice. All you had to do was beat the eggs thoroughly and drizzle them into the boiling broth to create these strands. Then they would be seasoned or thickened with flour and cornstarch, and people were also fans of adding bits of fish or potatoes in there. Also, an interesting historical fact is that a lot of Chinese American restaurants used to serve egg drop soup at discounted prices during the Depression. That's some real community spirit. Also, yet another fun fact is that unlike with most dishes, it was actually people on the rural side of the country that benefited the most from this dish. People living in cities had to purchase eggs and make thinner versions with water and salt as they didn't have enough for seasonings. Cabbage and noodles typically just looked like a pound of cabbage and a medium serving of noodles. More or less, it was not the most expensive dish, and you could enjoy a bowl by making it pretty quickly. Away from the pancake and pie-addled fanatics or admirers of noodles across the states, everyone needs their cravings satisfied from time to time, even if the soaring prices spared no one. In some areas, cabbage and noodles was known as Haluski. However, in most places, it was simply referred to as cabbage and noodles, the most typical Depression-era noodle recipe. It's a must-have that needed to be in your repertoire if you were to survive the times and not forget every taste you ever loved. Someone really needs to study how times like these bring out everyone's culinary creativity. If you go over to the village of Finnan in Scotland, you'll find Finnan Haddie, which in America is a euphoric Scotty banger. Give the room 2 minutes, and if everyone isn't seated, settled, and forked up in about 2 minutes max, I'll hand you a cash prize. If you want to get really authentic and traditional, you cook the smoked haddock over an open fire on a wooden stove. Really though, there were all kinds of ways of cooking Finnan Haddie. People would bake it, steam it, boil it, and do all kinds of other things. It's one of the most popular fish dishes in America for a pretty good reason though, and it's the same reason corn oysters got so popular. There are lots of coastal cities in America, and the fishing industry is thriving and bustling. Especially throughout the 1980s, it was really common for people to just live off of the catches of the day and whatever you'd find swimming upstream in the river. Unfortunately, though, it pretty much existed as this rural, regional specialty in coastal areas. Finnan Haddie was usually made with a lot of cream, fat, and butter, which meant that it wasn't going to last with all the healthy eating trends that were taking over. People ended up forgetting it, and outside of some traditional Scottish communities, no one even really knows about this dish. You can't call it vintage since it wasn't that long ago, which makes its immense fall-off even more surprising. Lentil stew was a popular choice for armies in need of a high-protein, long-lasting food source. Dried lentils, easy to store and transport, packed a nutritional punch. For soldiers on the move, these tiny legumes could provide both sustenance and energy during grueling campaigns. Packed with fiber, protein, and iron, lentils were often simmered with whatever spices or vegetables were at hand. Simple, but efficient. What makes lentil stew so interesting is its versatility. With the right ingredients, it could be tailored to fit the region's available resources. In places where fresh vegetables were scarce, the lentils acted as the star, absorbing flavors from salt pork or dried meats. While it may not have been the most exciting meal, it was certainly reliable. Imagine having a dish that could fuel you through a long march and leave you feeling full. Pretty much the perfect comfort food for someone who's been up before dawn and marched all day. In the world of wartime meals, lentil stew might not have won any culinary awards, but it definitely kept the troops marching forward. People in hard times had a simple rule. If it had even a hint of usefulness left in it, you didn't throw it away. That's how something as unlikely as boiled corn cobs became the key ingredient in corncob jelly, a Depression-era creation that turned scraps into sweetness. After the kernels were stripped away for meals, the cobs weren't discarded. Instead, they were simmered in water until they released a light golden liquid. With a little sugar and pectin, that liquid thickened into a jelly that looked like honey and had a delicate, slightly corn-like sweetness. It was spread on biscuits, drizzled over pancakes, or simply spooned onto whatever bread was available. For farm families, corn was already a staple. Cornmeal, cornbread, and even corn dodgers were common. But corncob jelly was a stroke of ingenuity, proving that even the most overlooked part of a harvest could serve a purpose. It was especially popular in rural areas, where stretching resources was second nature. To some, corncob jelly is a relic of the past. To others, it's a reminder that making something from nothing wasn't just a skill, it was a necessity. It turned what should have been waste into something worth savoring, one jar at a time. When a meal needed to be stretched, dumplings were a go-to solution. But when flour was scarce and meat was expensive, families had to get creative. That's how Bologna and cornbread dumplings found their way to the dinner table, a dish that took two cheap ingredients and turned them into something hearty. Cornmeal was an affordable staple, especially in the South where cornbread was already a common dish. Instead of traditional dumplings made with flour, families mixed cornmeal with water or milk to form a dough. Chunks of Bologna, one of the cheapest meats available, were folded in, adding a little protein and salty flavor. The dumplings were then dropped into boiling water or broth, cooking up into a soft, filling meal. This dish was pure ingenuity. Bologna was one of the most budget-friendly meats of the time, and cornbread was a familiar way to stretch a meal. Together, they created a dumpling that was easy to make, filling, and, at least in tough times, satisfying. Bologna and cornbread dumplings were about making something from nothing, using the simplest ingredients to create a meal that filled stomachs and carried families through the hardest days. When there was nothing Kentucky's Burgoo Fest in Owensboro is actually one of the best things to do in the whole state. The Burgoo Festival is one of the most renowned festivals across the country, and Owensboro itself is known as the Burgoo capital of the world too. The actual history of the Burgoo comes from the 19th century African-American communities that first made this into a southern dish. A lot of them were working in plantations and had to really play clever with their ingredients, and this meant that Burgoo was something people couldn't live without. That only got worse when the Civil War rolled around and people started incorporating the recipe into the mainstream due to its ability to feed massive groups of people. The Burgoo itself is this really thick and dense stew that has mashed potatoes, chicken, and all kinds of vegetables. You know those little quirks that each state has? The kind of thing that it becomes popular for, that everyone starts recognizing it for? That's basically what this was. As far as names go, this is probably the most insulting one I've ever seen. But nonetheless, a garbage plate is a Rochester classic, and if you're ever in New York, you'd be doing yourself a disservice by not trying it. Yes, you heard me right, a garbage plate. Not following? I wouldn't blame you. If someone told me to eat that, I'd probably think they were making fun of me. In reality, though, a garbage plate is pretty much just this massive behemoth-sized platter that you can really customize and adjust however you would like. Pasta fan? Throw in some macaroni and homemade fries. Meathead? You can't ever have enough ham, sausages, and chicken. Vegetable addict? Works for everyone. Still, who came up with such a massive display of gluttony? Nick Tahu Hots, which used to be one of the top restaurants in New York in 1918, founded by Nick Tahu, apparently made the dish for the first time. It was his way of giving customers the most bang for their buck and giving them a big meal for an affordable price. Quickly, it became a quintessential part of New York's street food culture and a symbol of the kind of indulgence you'd only find in the streets of New York City. The name itself apparently comes from how it looks, which, well, isn't really flattering. Lettuce past its prime wasn't something to throw away. It was something to transform. Wilted lettuce salad was a clever way to make the most of garden greens that had started to droop, and it turned an almost wasted ingredient into a dish with real flavor. This wasn't a crisp, refreshing salad. It was something entirely different. Instead of tossing out wilted lettuce, families salvaged it by dressing it up with a warm, tangy bacon grease dressing. The hot grease, often mixed with vinegar, sugar, and a pinch of salt, would slightly cook the lettuce, giving it a soft, savory bite. Sometimes onions or hard-boiled eggs were added if they were available. The practice of making wilted salads wasn't new. It had deep roots in Southern and Appalachian kitchens, where nothing went to waste. During tough times, people had to be resourceful, and using every bit of homegrown produce was essential. Lettuce might have been too delicate to last long without refrigeration, but with a little ingenuity, even the droopiest leaves had a second life. Wilted lettuce salad was a reminder of the era's mindset. Waste nothing, use everything. It was about stretching ingredients, finding comfort in simplicity, and proving that even tired lettuce could still have its moment on the table. When sugar was too expensive and food had to stretch, people turned to what was available. Molasses milk was a simple but effective way to add some much-needed energy to the day. Molasses was a pantry staple in many homes, especially in the South, where sugarcane processing made it cheap and accessible. It lasted longer than sugar, had essential minerals like iron and calcium, and most importantly, it was affordable. Families would stir a spoonful into a glass of milk, creating a slightly sweet, slightly bitter drink that packed more nutrients than plain milk alone. Some even believed it had health benefits, making it an early version of a fortified drink. This wasn't just a product of the Depression. It had been around for generations. In farming communities, molasses was often used as a sweetener when refined sugar was too costly. Children drank it before heading to school, and laborers relied on it for an energy boost before a long day of work. For those who grew up with it, molasses milk was a taste of childhood, a reminder of tough but resourceful times. It wasn't fancy, but it was proof that sometimes all you needed was a little sweetness to get through the day. Beef barley soup is but a humble dish that comes right from tales of peasant wives making hearty breakfasts for their families. sorry for sounding like a Lord of the Rings extra for a second. Really though, beef barley soup is as vintage as a recipe can get. Barley itself is one of the most ancient grains we have, not just in the States, but all across the world. Again, the idea of pairing it with beef is something we took from our European buddies that immigrated to Uncle Sam's greener pastures. When they weren't looking so green, and trust me, the 1930s and 40s were a long time, it was in everyone's mutual interest to play it smart. By that I mean there was a lot of inspiration to take from all the different communities around in the States. What is America if not a melting pot of different cultures? Beef barley soup used a lot less meat than the recipe typically calls for, but the substitute of roasted vegetables really brought it all together in a wonderful way. It was now not just a peasant dish for field workers, but something everyone had daily, because it was the best they could get. Minnesota's always a place you associate with big families that like to hold even bigger feasts. Naturally, in such a place, dishes that have a lot of crowd-pleasing abilities take first place. Hot dishes, which are a type of casserole, fit that bill perfectly. For the longest time, hot dishes have been a massive part of the comfort food traditions of America. But that couldn't be truer than it is for Minnesota. Ground beef, pasta, peas, green beans, and corn, and the creamiest and cheesiest sauce you know are the tricks to making a good hot dish. And it's something that Minnesotans just can't seem to replace. A lot of people actually seem to think that this love of a hot dish comes from the struggles Minnesota suffered throughout the post-World War II and Great Depression periods. Back then, it was extremely vital that people prepare dishes that could feed entire families with minimal ingredients. As the name implies, it's also pretty hot, which makes it perfect for the winters and for reheating it. Potlucks and casseroles were always something that was really popular in America, especially in Minnesota, and this casserole is textbook proof of that never-ending trend. Chitlins have a longer history than you might think. They were originally a survival food for poor people, right? Especially in the American South. Now it's exactly those roots that tied it so strongly to its community. People had been relying on this for years, and they had honestly come to be too familiar with it, especially in African American communities. In West Africa even, you have lots of dishes that involve offal meat. But chitlins weren't out of their initial image just yet. They were still considered a poor man's food, and in truth, that is what they were. Even in the late 1800s, it was really just sharecroppers and southern farmers that had these. It wasn't until the early 20th century that chitlins had become rooted the way I was talking about. They were still largely popular in just the South, but it was things like the Chitlin circuit where legends like Aretha Franklin and B.B. Kings were known to perform and help turn them into a common food. I mean, the circuit was known for having chitlins on hand all the time. Despite that, they still were considered a low-class food mostly because of the way it would take hours to cook and clean it to remove the smell. That part really put a lot of people off of it. Recently, though, in the 2000s, a lot of soul food restaurants have tried to reinvent it and have started offering chitlins served in really premium ways, doubling down on the cultural attachment while bringing culinary finesse. A lot of the reason that something ends up being considered rich is because people with money tend to really just value the different subtleties and nuances in their ingredients. Heirloom tomatoes were once considered a poor man's food, tasting different than how the usual ones did. This is what led to a lot of people just marking them off and thinking they're not really worth the time or money, but later on, this is exactly what made them rise to fame too. Plus, there was a practical reason. Heirloom tomatoes were grown with an emphasis on flavor, complexity, and just being a generally more pleasant experience with more depth when it came to flavor. Normal tomatoes were grown prioritizing their resistance to rot and disease. They were meant to last long and be sturdy. Farmers didn't really think much of how juicy they would be, how they would feel to touch, and the texture. Later on, towards the end of the 20th century, it was these exact reasons that caused heirloom tomatoes to start becoming more and more beloved among food circles in America. Now, they're considered a very premium ingredient. For sailors at sea, ship's biscuit was the original survival food. Tough, durable, and ready for whatever the ocean could throw at it. Made from flour, water, and sometimes salt, this dense, rock-like bread was a necessity during long voyages. The biscuits were designed to last for months without spoiling, but in the humid, salty conditions aboard ships, they often came with an unwelcome bonus: weevils. Yes, those little critters that make every meal feel like a crunch on a whole new level. Despite its toughness and the occasional extra protein from those weevils, ship's biscuit was a staple for maritime forces. While sailors would dunk them in water or soup to soften them, it didn't make them any more appetizing. In fact, if you've ever wondered why sailors were often depicted with a scowl, maybe it wasn't just the rough seas. Maybe it was the food. The biscuit's longevity was its biggest asset. In a world where fresh food was a luxury, ship's biscuit could endure for months in storage. But let's face it, if your lunch comes with a side of bugs, you might start dreaming of anything but biscuits. Still, it was a part of naval life. Tough, resilient, and certainly something you'd hope to eat only out of necessity. Prune pudding was one of the more niche dishes that were created during the Great Depression. What really was surprising was that prune pudding extended to the upper royalty as well, since even prominent VIPs would also be real low budget with how they eat. Prune pudding became very popular as a result of the efforts made by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who would serve prune pudding at White House functions. It stained the White House's culinary track record, sure, but earned massive points with the struggling American people. For being made of such a simple ingredient and some syrups of your choice, it was definitely one of the tastiest and cheapest meals to come home to. Corn oysters are pretty much what happens when nature runs its due course. See, these were always wildly popular in South Carolina and the countryside over there, and for some pretty good reasons. People that live in Carolina have a neat little advantage over others in that they end up right next to a sizable coast. Of course, this means they get all the benefits you'd normally associate with living by the coast too. Namely, a never-ending supply of fresh oysters. Then you have the state's long and pretty colorful history with agriculture, specifically corn. Back in the colonial settler days, Native Americans actually taught most people how to cultivate corn and farm it properly. Why was it such a regional hit? Well, it's not so much a regional thing as much as it is an American thing. Corn is one of the few things that American soil is pretty good for growing, so naturally people were going to take advantage of it wherever they could. It's just smart business, you get what I mean? That's how so many corn dishes became popular. It was either that or starvation for a lot of people. So, what happens when you put two and two together? Corn oysters were such a regional hit exactly because it was so easy for everyone to get them. It didn't matter what your bank looked like, so long as you had a way to the local fish and farmers markets. Look, even if it has turned into a luxury dish today, I'm still not eating snails. Sorry, Escargot. Funnily enough, a lot of people used to think that way. So how exactly do snails go from being an insult your third-grade teacher slings at you to something you pay $100 and above at some restaurants when you're out on a special date? The thing is, escargot was something that people had typically begun to eat in the Depression out of necessity. Since there was nothing around, people had really took to exploring what Mother Nature had to offer. What they found out was that snails actually weren't so bad in a pickle, but that didn't mean they wanted to keep the habit long-term, until French restaurants in the middle of the 20th century began to popularize the dish once again. Now, escargot started to become something of a premium, a fine dining dish associated with Parisian restaurant culture, and all the white wine it came with didn't help that at all. Barbecue spaghetti is a Memphis, Tennessee classic, and it takes the best of both worlds. You have barbecue, which is something that Memphis swore long ago that it couldn't live without, and you have spaghetti. Memphis-style barbecue works extremely well with spaghetti because it has a big focus on the smoky and tangy side of things. This barbecue uses a sauce that's made out of marinara and a tomato-based barbecue sauce too, which is a big part of what gives it that smoky flavor. Then, you have your pulled pork and chicken, along with some classics like bell peppers and garlic, which give the dish its finishing touches as far as flavor is concerned. Despite its status as a regional classic, this is really just a new dish that only recently made its name in the Memphis food scene. It wasn't always there, but what was a big and ancient part of Memphis tradition is barbecuing. You could just consider this another successful experiment in that long-lasting tradition. It's originally believed that African American communities came up with barbecue spaghetti, and it was probably a way to get rid of leftover meat. Since there probably wasn't enough to constitute a full plate, people would often mix it with any kind of grain or starch to get a full meal. Let's not forget all the times a well-made bacon and onion sandwich made the difference between an exhausting, bland day and one with a warm and welcome surprise. Most people would be real cautious with their bacon, as the days of simply frying up a few strips and eating them as is were gone. You had to make each cut of meat count, especially bacon. While it was still attainable on average, its new prices were not doing anybody any favors. So people would dice up some onions, sauté them until they were that perfect golden brown, and make the bread themselves. Sometimes out of stuff like sawdust when dough would not be available, and there you had it. A perfectly vitalizing sandwich ready to put the spirit back into your tired body. Grandmas had this perfected down to a science, as they seemed to have developed a natural intuition for how much bacon, salt, and onions a good sandwich needed. Now, fermented foods like kimchi and sauerkraut, as well as miso, had started out as these really innovative and practical solutions to help preserve food before refrigeration had become such a household concept. But once they had begun to be associated with a lot of poor communities and rural ones, they started to be shunned away. Before refrigeration, fermentation was a pretty necessary way to help store food for the winters in all sorts of countries, not just America. It was more or less the staple way to preserve things for a lot of rural communities and farmsteads. Fermented foods were overlooked in more urban areas because of the harsh scents and the peasant-like feel of it, but that was really just people being snobby. They've got the opposite image now. I mean, haven't you seen all those viral TikToks about homegrown fermented kimchi? Lots of modern science also backs up the various health benefits of fermented foods. Who knows? Maybe it's what you need too. Collard greens have been a peasant food for many reasons and for a long time. They were really popular in African American culture for sharecroppers, small farmsteads, rural villages, and more. A lot of people relied on them for centuries, but their reputation was always that of low-class food. Towards the 20th century, collard greens began to gain some respect as a symbol of the South and its humble, rustic cuisine. Now, what I like to think is that this dish was in the right place at the right time. See, towards the end of the 20th century, there was a massive health scare going around all of America, particularly the South. What can I say? Years of drippings, bacon, lard, fat, and deep frying things in oil or beer or both may do that to you. Collard greens began a light that people were flocking to, full moth style. People were familiar enough with them, had an acquired taste for them too, and liked all the different spins you could throw on the dish. So for a lot of people, they were the first step towards a healthier lifestyle. And that's really why they did a complete 180. When party food had to be made on a tight budget, creativity took center stage. That's how Bologna cake became a thing. An unusual but surprisingly resourceful dish that turned cheap lunch meat into something that at least looked impressive. Bologna had long been a staple of budget-conscious households. It was cheap, lasted longer than fresh meats, and could be eaten cold or fried. But when it came time for gatherings, families needed something that felt festive. That's where this layered creation came in. Slices of bologna were stacked like a cake, with a frosting of cream cheese or mayo spread between each layer. Some versions had mustard mixed in for extra bite. The final touch? A decorative piping of more cream cheese around the edges, sometimes with a sprinkle of paprika for color. As odd as it sounds today, this dish reflected a time when people made the most of what they had. In an era when processed meats were more affordable than fresh cuts, Bologna found its way into countless meals. For some, Bologna cake was a symbol of thrift and ingenuity. For others, it was simply a way to put something celebratory on the table when times were tough. Either way, it proved that with a little effort, even the humblest ingredients could be dressed up for an occasion. During long military campaigns, soldiers needed food that could withstand the rigors of travel, storage, and time. Salt pork and beans, a combination that became a military staple, particularly during the colonial and Napoleonic Wars. Salt pork was the go-to protein for soldiers because it could be stored for months without refrigeration. The pork was heavily salted to preserve it, a method that also gave it a distinctive, sometimes overpowering flavor. Soldiers learned to love, or at least tolerate, the salty taste, especially when paired with the hearty goodness of beans. Beans, often the dried variety, were another long-lasting and easy-to-prepare food source. When combined with salt pork, they formed a simple, calorie-dense meal that could be boiled up over a campfire. Whether cooked with a little extra fat or simply simmered in water, this dish provided the soldiers with both protein and the energy to endure grueling days on the march. Of course, the meal was hardly a gourmet affair. In fact, some soldiers were less than thrilled by the monotony of it. As any soldier might tell you, when it comes to survival food, variety takes a backseat to reliability. Salt pork and beans delivered just that: reliable sustenance, no matter the season or the conditions. Speaking of molasses, they also went really great with some slow-baked beans. Molasses have a knack for adding a lot of deep flavor to a dish, and the fact that these were usually left overnight to absorb all of it made for probably the best baked beans people could get in those times. It was especially popular as a summertime meal. Baked beans were not too hard to get, not the tinned versions because those were still pricey. Once you had some, you would just leave them in water to soften, and then the beans would be baked for 8 hours straight overnight. Making it was a whole day, literally. But once you were done with the prep work, it was all just a waiting game, and this was one time where being patient really paid off. Now, bacon grease might seem like a strange thing to highlight, but hear me out. In a time when oil was scarce, bacon grease was like liquid gold. It was used for everything from frying potatoes to greasing pans. And let's be honest, it adds a flavor boost to just about anything. Can you imagine making biscuits with bacon grease? Oh, it was good. Bacon was one of the few adorable meats during this time, and it left behind grease, which was way too good to just toss out. Now, I know this bad boy has no nutritional value, but sometimes all you need is a little flavor in your life, and it's fine to have cheat days sometimes, right? So, while it might not be the healthiest option, it certainly helped to make those Dust Bowl meals a little more enjoyable. Mildred Armstrong Kalish lived in Iowa during the Great Depression. She recalls cooking with bacon grease, which she called her family's Tuscan olive oil. So, when protein was hard to come by, people got creative with what they had. Peanut butter soup was a Depression-era meal that turned a pantry staple into a warm, filling dish that kept hunger at bay. Peanut butter was cheap, packed with protein, and didn't spoil easily, making it a lifesaver for struggling families. Instead of spreading it thin on bread, some turned it into soup. The method was simple. Peanut butter was mixed with water or milk and heated until it became a creamy, slightly nutty broth. Some added sugar for a sweeter version, while others used salt and onions to create something more savory. This dish wasn't just a product of tough times. Variations of peanut-based soups existed long before the Great Depression, especially in African and Asian cuisines. But in America, it became a way to stretch a single jar of peanut butter further than sandwiches ever could. It may not have been a culinary masterpiece, but peanut butter soup did what it needed to: provide warmth, nutrition, and just enough comfort to make a tough day a little easier. For those who ate it, the memory stuck. Not for its taste, but for what it represented, making do with whatever was on hand and turning the simplest ingredients into survival. Potatoes had more use than just what was under all the layers. Once peeled, people would often fry the potato skins as a midday snack. Nothing would ever go to waste in homes back then, as you must have gathered by now. If they can make stuff out of sausage drippings and drain the fat from bacon to reuse, frying up some potato skins does not seem that out of the box at all. These fried skins were the perfect sidekick to potato pancakes, and the fact that the skins had a lot of health benefits made it all the more appealing. Things like this really helped to keep appetites in check, and that meant that the financial situation of the home would be calmer too. Gooey butter cake is arguably the top dog in terms of desserts and things to eat. People love it for two reasons. Gooey butter cake became a hit in the 1980s as a wallet-friendly dessert, perfect for potlucks, bake sales, or family gatherings. Its simple ingredients, flour, sugar, eggs, and a generous amount of butter meant it was affordable to make and easy to share. During tough economic times, home bakers loved that this rich, indulgent cake would feed a crowd without breaking the bank. You couldn't beat that texture, and the buttery flavor is exactly what you need after a long shift in the summer heat. This cake is made with more butter than any doctor will say is safe for you, but the end result is just too delicious to pass up on. A lot of people seem to think that the dish's origins are rooted in German and Eastern European immigrants that first came on over and settled down in St. Louis. It's actually so deeply associated with the area that the other name for this dish is the St. Louis Gooey butter cake. It really lives up to that name too, because that gooey filling on the inside is nothing short of heavenly. It's something that tourists stop in the area for and try all the time, and the locals just can't ever seem to get enough of it. That wraps up all the poor man's lunches that got us through tough times. Comment below if you've ever had any of these dishes, and don't forget to like and subscribe.